night was silent, unnaturally still as if the entire world held its breath. A perfect setting for a crime yet to be solved. Shadows danced across the grand halls of the Alexandra Palace, a light flickering, casting strange shapes on the walls. Mary Straften stood in the centre of the great hall, her eyes fixed on the rose window above, her face pale, with a mixture of determination and fear. The air was charged with an energy that felt almost alive, humming and crackling around her. She knew she was close, too close perhaps, to uncovering something that no one was meant to see. The sudden, echoing crash from one of the far corners of the hall sent a chill through her, but she stood her ground. The bomb had hit, and they were running out of time. Felix back again with another story that's kept me awake a far few nights, I can tell you that. It's the 21st of October, and I've got a fantastic one from the archives. I do believe this may be still an ongoing issue, but I haven't had any recent reports, so maybe we're in the clear. Even so, it's a fantastic one I really wanted to share with you. I really love this one. It's really fun. This one is like a mix of science and the occult, and almost like a detective novel. Okay, so you have to imagine, here's the scene. The war is raging across Europe, and in the hidden halls of the great Alexandra Palace, something truly dangerous was brewing. So let me take you back to 1945, where the lines between science and something much darker began to blur. A group of scientists, led by the enigmatic Mary Straften, are attempting to harness an unknown form of energy, a force derived from ancient Egyptian relics stolen by the Nazis during the height of the war. Mary had turned double agent, defecting to work for the British, offering her knowledge of these ancient artifacts in exchange for protection. She was brilliant, but relentless, her cold demeanour leaving many of her staff fearful. But fear or not, the scientists and technicians worked tirelessly under her direction, driven by the promise of discovering an energy that could change the course of the war forever. Mary's research centered around extracting what she called ethereal resonance, natural energies that she believed were embedded inside occult relics, such as the items the British Empire had found in ancient Egypt. These artifacts, including the Staff of Set and the Amulet of Anubis, were inscribed with symbols and runes that suggested a connection to some forgotten force, a power that could be invoked and harnessed. Her aim was to channel this energy into a usable form, something that could potentially turn the tide of war. The experiments were fraught with danger, the lines between science and the occult blurring more with every attempt. To the British government, desperate to gain an upper hand, it was worth the risk, and they decided to turn a blind eye to Mary's methods, even when she resorted to experimenting on animals and eventually prisoners of war. The great hall of the Alexandra Palace had been transformed into a laboratory filled with arrays of equipment, resonance chambers, amplifiers, and symbols drawn in chalk on the floor. The researchers worked day and night, their faces pale from lack of sleep, and the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to grow heavier with every passing day. Some of the scientists began to whisper about the strange occurrences that seemed to follow their work. Objects moved on their own, shadows shifted when no one was near, and the temperature in the room would suddenly plummet. The air was thick with tension. There was a palpable sense that they were pushing it too far, and something was pushing back. The Staff of Set was used to amplify the resonance within the hall, and the Amulet of Anubis was placed in the centre of the array, believed to act as a conduit between realms. Books would slide across tables, chairs would scrape across the floor in the dead of the night, and instruments would topple with no visible cause. To me, this kind of intrigue is what makes it worth to work here, those unexplainable moments that make you question what lies beneath the surface of history. One incident stood out among the rest. In here on page 14, it says about a glass beaker. A scientist had wrote it was filled with a strange liquid and it shattered spontaneously, shedding shards flying across the room. The researcher who'd been holding it claimed he had felt a force, a pulse of energy that emanated from the beaker itself. Of course, this could have been a reaction of different chemicals, but he also mentioned that when he picked up the shards of glass, there were almost charred fingerprints on the glass, as if something from somewhere else had touched it or squeezed it to break. Mary Straften's theories were not just about energy. She believed that these artifacts could channel a sentient force, something ancient, something with a will of its own, and she also believed that they could control it, that they could harness the power beyond anything conventional science could offer. But the deeper they went, the more erratic the phenomena became. Researchers reported seeing lights, small floating orbs, moving erratically across the room, almost as if they were alive. A technician claimed he heard whispers emanating from the resonance chamber, voices speaking in a language that sounded ancient, neither German nor English, but something altogether different, possibly Egyptian. The use of the amulet of Anubis was particularly concerning. It was said to hold the essence of the ancient Egyptian priest, bound within it to guard the secrets of the underworld. During a particularly intense experiment, the energy reading spiked. The equipment began to malfunction and the strange hum filled the great hall. The sound seemed to vibrate through the bones of everyone present. The ceiling lights started to flicker, and suddenly the scientists, one by one, dropped to the floor, eyes wide in terror, skin a pale green, claiming they had seen figures and hands reaching out from the light, trying to grasp at them, as if dead on cue to try to cull the creatures crossing over into this dimension. The bombs fell onto the building, causing shockwaves of broken glass and debris to flutter room to room until the entire building was engulfed in a thick smog. When the smoke had settled, it became clear that most of the equipment had survived and at least 3/4 of the personnel were uninjured. Despite this, it had become clear to Mary's military handlers that this was too dangerous, and quite likely there was a German mole somewhere in the building, tipping off the locations and the research that they were uncovering. They promptly made the decision to close everything down, to pack away the research, to bury everything they had uncovered, but of course, it was already too late. Something had already been unleashed inside the building. Mary herself wrote in the final notes that she feared she'd opened a door that could not be closed. Her notes, and some of the other notes from the scientists at the time, described shadows that followed her, growing darker and more solid with each passing day. She also wrote the presence that seemed to settle in the room at night, a chill that gripped her soul, and whispered voices that filled the silence. Her last entry was chillingly abrupt. "We've gone too far. I fear it's too late to stop it." It wasn't just the immediate danger that haunted Alexandra Palace. It was what happened on the locked-off floor below that really made a difference going forward. This was the basement where many of the experiments took place that involved the prisoners of war. Even decades later, we find report after report of people claiming the same thing. Pockets of time that seemed to shift. People would enter the floor only to find themselves trapped in what appeared to be the 1940s, but inhabiting the bodies of the prisoners of war using Mary's experiments. They described hearing the hum of the resonance chambers, feeling the cold, damp air, and experiencing the horror of being experimented on, only to suddenly wake up traumatized but back in the present day. For them, what felt like weeks had only been hours in reality. But the trauma was real, and they carried with them the memories of fear and pain that were not their own. Complex descriptions of experiments that no one could have known except for Mary herself. And we have the ability to cross-reference these with Mary's own recordings of her experiments. And it was only till recently when the Ministry of Defense had released this information, meaning that over the last 30 years, no ordinary citizen who had ventured down there and experienced this would have had access to her writings. Decades later, the echoes of Mary's work still linger. Today, Alexandra Palace stands as a monument to history, but beneath its grandeur lies a dark past. Those who work there now report strange occurrences. The security guards speak of fleeting glimpses of robed figures standing by the rose window, a figure that vanishes when approached. Technicians have reported equipment failures, sudden power outages, and a cold that sweeps through suddenly out of nowhere. It's almost as if fragments of Mary's lab, lost in the chaotic experiments of the past, are slipping through time and reappearing in the present. Well, listeners, I do have an update though. That was going to be the end of the story, but just as I was piecing this all together and ready to send it off to the intern to post it on the YouTube, I received an email from a colleague with access to the old military archives. And I must say, this is an email I have been eagerly waiting for. It says, Alexandra Palace Project, new findings. Now, although I must admit, a lot of these stories are steeped in the blood of innocence, and it is awfully sad and terrible what happened, but as a archivist and historian and someone who wants to log these findings and ensure that nothing happens again so terribly, my heart did skip a beat when I opened it. We finally had an outline of some of the stuff that had really happened. We had direct information from a staff sergeant who was posted there to check up on Mary, and these are his personal notes of what he saw, things that were never officially put on the record. The first attempt was an experiment, and this was to harness what Mary called the ethereal resonance. There were diagrams, these were intricately hurried, showing an array that had been constructed in the Great Hall. There was also an attachment that contained a report after the sergeant had spoken to one of the technicians, and it was also a first-hand account of the final night. The staff sergeant described a strange hum, an almost mechanical resonance that seemed to grow louder the further the scientist pushed, until the vibration was going through their bones in a way that felt wrong and invasive. To me, this is the essence of these tales. The thrill of discovery tinged with danger, the feeling that you're brushing up against something far greater than yourself. Mary Straften theorized that they had unleashed something ancient, something that thrived on the basest human emotions: fear, despair, anger, and it was drawn to them like a predator sensing weakness. Once it was free, it wouldn't stop. It would seek out fear, feed on it, and grow stronger. And that's when the realization hit me like a lead weight. They hadn't just opened a door, they had invited something through, something that had been waiting on the other side for centuries. But what if it wasn't what we thought? What if somehow the figure in the shadows wasn't an entity of malevolent force, but something trying to communicate a warning? One of Mary's assistants, Evelyn Clark, had tried to continue the work after the project was abandoned. Her notes suggested that she too had experienced visions, dreams that seemed more like memories. She saw herself as Mary, reliving moments from the experiments, but in a world that had been destroyed, a wasteland ravaged by atomic fire. What if the figure was Mary herself, from another timeline, another version of reality where everything had gone wrong? What if she was trying to reach out, to stop the experiments before it was too late, to stop them finding the ultimate source of power and engulfing the world in atomic flame? The idea was both terrifying and fascinating. A future Mary, twisted by her own desperate attempts to undo the damage, trying to warn herself or perhaps Evelyn before history repeats itself again. And now, decades later, the echoes of that dark presence are still out there, waiting. The people working in the Alexandra Palace today still report strange anomalies, the objects appearing from the 1940s, seemingly untouched by time, and rooms that appear and disappear as if fragments of the past are slipping into the present. Maybe it's not the malevolent force we assumed. Maybe it's Mary Straften herself, fractured across the timelines, trying to warn us of an impending disaster. What if this robed figure is future Mary, trapped in the timeline where the experiments led to a dystopian Armageddon, trying desperately to reach back and change the outcome? It could be Mary trying to avert the dark future she foresaw, a desperate attempt to prevent her own research for an unleashing catastrophe. Perhaps in her desperation, she has become a twisted, fractured presence, struggling to help, yet inadvertently causing chaos in her attempts. Whatever it is, it leaves us questioning what boundaries we may have crossed and what the consequences will ultimately be if this dark future can be avoided or if it has already begun. Looking at the evidence, it seems to me that we're dealing with what I would classify as a Class 5 temporal rupture phenomenon, a kind of disturbance that creates micro interdimensional pockets capable of affecting the human soul. These pockets seem to pull individuals into them, and they force them to inhabit the first available vessel. Because we see that some have reported experiencing life through the bodies of the prisoners, while others through the animals used in the experiments and even the scientists themselves, each living as if they were merely passengers, watching history unfold. I'll be logging this in section Delta 5 of the archives, where we keep records of phenomena involving multi-dimensional and temporal disruptions. The real challenge isn't piecing together what happened, it's figuring out how to prevent these echoes from turning into future catastrophes. Anyway, and as always, the search for answers goes on. I'm going to enjoy a lovely cup of hot chocolate, and I've just picked up a sausage roll this morning from a cute little bakery. I'm going to enjoy that, and yes, and I think I'll have a lovely day. Sorry to waffle on. I hope you've had a lovely day too. Remember to like and subscribe, and to leave me some comments if you're enjoying the content, as that's super helpful. The internet mentioned that as the channel is so young, doing that will really help us. And all the best. Have a fantastic evening, and I'll see you again soon.